took like 3 days to read it.
I'm sure. Did you
You forget
stumble
how
on
to read.
her?
You forget how to read, and it was kind of weird that some of the words that you write, you realize you never enunciate. So you're like, how do I pronounce this word? But it was a good experience. Your throat was hurting, everything.
So I know we just started talking. We will do an intro, but really people should listen to it. It is so interesting and amazing to listen to Bakari tell his own story in his own voice and his own intonations. I mean, all of it. It's amazing. So, okay, so we are live on Facebook. So if anybody wants to share this, please feel free to find it on the Zionist Facebook page and to share it so that other people in your network can join us. People can ask questions on either the chat function on the Zoom or on the Facebook Live. We're monitoring it. And I will make sure to leave time for questions at the end. And honestly, I was thinking a lot about this. Do I want to do Bakari's intro, which will be like 7 minutes of the time that we have together because it's so long and impressive. And I'm not going to, not because I don't want to waste the time, but because so much of his story will come out in our conversation of the book. So I think it's better to have it come out that way. So I really just want to start by saying, Bakari, thank you. You are so incredible. If anybody, I'm sure a lot of people watch CNN. I think they have a pretty wide audience. So you've probably seen Bakari on CNN. He is one of the most remarkable commentators. He always knows the right thing to say. He's hilarious. Follow him on Twitter. Follow his children on Twitter. They have an amazing Instagram account. And so Bakari, that's first of all, thank you so much for doing this. I really want to start with where you start in the book, which is in Denmark, South Carolina. And you talk about how it used to have bustling businesses and there was prosperity, even though it was a rural Black community. And those businesses aren't there anymore. And you call Denmark the forgotten Black South. And since a lot of what we want to talk about tonight is a both celebration and honoring of Black history, I think it's important for people to think about what you mean by that, by the forgotten Black South. So let's start there.
So first, let me just say thank you. I am from Denmark, and my mom and dad always tell me the two most important words in the English language are the words thank you. And you've been a great friend and supporter of mine for a long period of time. So it's a heartfelt thank you to you. I have a couple of friends who are joining the call. So shout out to Jamie Shadian. I know that's her maiden name. Forgive me for not knowing your new married last name. And Stacy Selkin, who's my neighbor. Shout out to you as well. And thank you for everybody who's taking a little time. And thank you for allowing me to push the time back. I was just with our new United States Senator. We were having a belated swearing in ceremony for John Ossoff. And it was just an amazing experience. And they were ready to get rid of me anyway, because the next guest they had was Stacey Abrams. So they're in good hands over there. You asked a good question about Denmark. Denmark is, you're right, it once was bustling. You know, when you go through these small towns, just a couple of stoplights, but you can remember the theater, the bank, you can remember the appliance store, the five and dime store, the record store, the little restaurants you had. And everybody who's from small town America can remember those things and also tell you today that a lot of those things have dissipated and gone. Some of it has to do with CAFTA and NAFTA, which I outline in my book, free trade, and how throughout our the early 90s, a lot of our textile mills and manufacturing plants closed down due to our trade policy. Growing up in Denmark, I lived in a food desert where people can't go 2 and 3 miles and get access to fresh fruits and vegetables. Our hospital closed about over a decade ago. Our water system is dilapidated like much of the infrastructure in the country. So when you think about all of these things, you realize that a lot of it is neglect, a lot of it is policy, a lot of it is the fact that both our United States capitals and our state capitals have turned their back on these small rural areas. And yes, this was an area of Black middle class, the Black middle class, the Black working class. You had people who had some semblance of wealth, and that's no more. It's a great deal of poverty in these areas, and they're a shell of what they used to be.
And why? I mean, what happened well, I mean, you talked about what the reality is now, but what happened along the way? How did these areas become?
I, I, I think you saw individuals migrating to larger cities. Our country became more urbanized. Uh, Ron Brownstein actually talks about our two-party system, and in that he analyzes it to say that Democrats are moving to cities that are more urban. Republicans are moving to areas that are shrinking and more rural. And you see these rural areas truly are shrinking. The populations are decreasing in these areas. With those populations go talent. With those populations go resources. I guess the best example I can give you is that my schools are along what's called the corridor of shame. It's where kids go to school and their heating and air don't work, where their infrastructure is falling apart. And the unique way about the way that we fund schools, most schools in the country, but particularly throughout the South, is it's a three-legged stool. It's state, federal, and local taxes. Well, you can't, it's really a catch-22. You can't improve your schools unless you bring in industry, but you can't bring in industry unless you improve your schools. And so you find yourself in this level of malaise and communities that are just stagnant, if not declining.
Yeah, I think we've talked about this before. I think education is everything, and it's so devastating that we don't invest in it. So, do you think that this is an issue of race, or is it an issue of class, or just the geography of rural communities? I mean, how if there were going to be a solution, how do you think it would be addressed?
That's a good question. I think it's a combination of both. I think that a lot of times people, this was one of my beefs with this is one of my beefs with a lot of my progressive friends who do not see the intersection of race and wealth or economics. It's pull yourself up by your bootstraps. If everybody gets paid a living wage, like racism won't exist. That's not the case by any stretch. Let's take COVID-19 and look at it analytically for an example. COVID-19 is devastating Black communities, both from an economic and a public health perspective. And most people want to ask the question, why? Especially, why are Black folk dying at higher rates? And just take Denmark, for example. You don't have access to quality care. You live in a food desert. So you're going and you are buying Kool-Aid that's like 10 cents. You get a pound of sugar, it stretches, or ramen noodles with a high MSG and sodium. You have these pre-existing conditions, preventable illnesses, etc. You have water that's not potable. Usually, you're either beside your living arrangements or beside the manufacturing plant or in a brownfield or something like that. So you're inhaling bad air. You have higher incidence of asthma, and you overlay that with a pandemic. It's no wonder you're dying at higher rates. And so I think that when we're looking at the issue of race, people have to look at the issue of race through power constructs. And we're talking about systemic inequities. We're not talking about somebody just calling you nigger. I mean, all you got to do is go to my social media page if you want to see that. We're talking about systemic inequalities that we see throughout this country.
Yeah, and I want to come back to the intergenerational wealth issue that you talk about in the book and how it's compounded and how it does intersect with race. So we will do that. But on a more positive note, you also in the very beginning of your book, you talk about your father's commitment and your commitment to HBCUs. And I know, as someone who follows you religiously, how passionate you are about the strength of HBCUs and how much they have done to help Black communities and Black people, become leaders. What Morehouse, which I love that you're repping on our call, what Morehouse means to you, how it sort of created you in a lot of ways. I mean, you talk in the book about a lot of different moments in your life that really created you, but your time at Morehouse, the lessons that you learned running for the president of the school, and how that has really propelled your political career, the lessons that you learned there. So would love to hear your reflection on HBCUs and also looking at our current political leadership, how many people graduated from HBCUs?
So I was going to say that, it's a unique time because we are seeing Yogananda Pittman, who is the new chief of the U.S. Capitol Police. You have Kamala Harris, of course, who is the vice president of the United States. You have Joyce Beatty, who's a Cheney State graduate, who is the new chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. And you have Raphael Warnock, who's a Morehouse man. And then you have them all riding in on the shoulders of Stacey Abrams, who's a Spelman alum. So people are now noticing the impact and influence and import of HBCUs. Many of us have known for a very long period of time, though, that the overwhelming majority of Black professionals, your architects, your doctors, your engineers, your lawyers, et cetera, have all come from HBCUs. In Morehouse, for example, it's not just Edwin Moses, Samuel L. Jackson, Spike Lee, Julian Bond, David Satcher, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and many others. But it's this new wave of individuals who you see now as a part of the next generation of civil rights leaders. We always say that they place a crown above your head for you to grow into. And that's probably the best way to describe it. It allows you to understand that you can compete anywhere in this 21st century global economy. And going to an historically Black college, and particularly an all-male historically Black college, people are always enamored when I talk about the diversity of it. Because we had Black folk from all across the world who were there, all throughout the diaspora. And that was something that really enriched and emboldened you. And so when you graduate, you realize that you don't have a choice but to play a larger outsized role in society.
So I realized as we were talking that we didn't define an HBCU, and I think probably everyone knows what it is, but for anyone on Facebook who's catching this, an HBCU is a historically Black college and university. Bakari, do you want to give us a little bit of the background of HBCUs?
Yeah, they're about, I want to say 107. My good friend Rodriguez would be mad at me. There are, because I don't know the exact number. It's either 107 or 109. Many of them are concentrated throughout the South. And of course, they were institutions of higher learning that were created when Blacks couldn't go to other institutions of higher learning. And when you think about HBCUs, it's a long example or a long litany of examples, both in athletics, from Walter Payton at Jackson State to politics, to just any amount of change you can see. I mean, people always go to Dr. King. I think he's an easy example, but there's so many of us who kind of made our way through. And a lot of HBCUs actually are land grant institutions as well. Your North Carolina A&Ts, your South Carolina States, et cetera. And so they play a unique role, integral role in many Southern states in their economy, and particularly agricultural economy.
So I realize we're going to jump around because there's a follow-up question that I want to ask to that before I come back to where we were going to go. But one of the things that I think is fascinating, and I feel like throughout this conversation, I'm going to say over and over again, for anyone watching who has not read this book, it is such a good book. I'm not just saying that. It is such a good book. There's something for everyone, and there's so much to learn. And one of the things that I loved, as like someone who cares a lot about politics too, is that you talked about your experience in Morehouse running for president and for the student body president, and which is a very coveted role, a very serious role. And you talked about building relationships with a lot of diverse communities within Morehouse. And just to go to your point about the diversity, I know that the Jewish community was, one of many groups that you reached out to, but I think it would be interesting for people to hear like how you thought about that. You say in the book that relationships are really the heart of politics, and you learned that at Morehouse, and you learned that actually making sure that people knew that you saw them. You talked about even people in the cafeteria, and that's a lesson. And you actually come back to it later in the book about how a lot of politicians don't do real retail politics. They don't canvass, they don't knock on doors, they don't feel like they have to do that. And so it's like you keep weaving these threads, and it's just so fascinating. But yeah, tell us about that, making sure people see.
So I think that people have to understand SJ President Morehouse is like star quarterback at University of Oklahoma, or starting shooting guard at the University of North Carolina. It just is that role. It's that leadership role that's coveted. And I ran a great race for SGA president. It was an amazing experience. I'll never forget it. I had to run, as you were talking about, I had to run more than once. I had to run 2 different elections. But I learned in that race that, and this is what I tell people often, something that I always remember, you got to recognize that the number one currency we have in politics is not dollars and cents. The number one currency we have in politics is relationships. You got to learn how to count in politics too. I mean, I remind people of that all the time. You know, politics is about 50% plus one vote. That's it. Not 51%, but 50% plus one vote. And you go out and you try to meet people where they are, and you try to build these coalitions, and you try to make sure that people see and understand that you see them. One of my proudest accomplishments, as you alluded to, was getting our cafeteria workers raises. You know, we got them to, I think at the time, I think it was like $12 an hour or something like that, $10, $12 an hour, which isn't a lot, but it was more than they had. Not only that, but I wasn't on a meal plan either. So that was quite helpful because they let me eat for free. But you know, we kept our eye on ensuring that other people had opportunity. And I think that when you get in this business of politics, people forget the true element of public service. And I learned that at a very early age.
Yeah, and you talk about that throughout, that it's not about politics, it's about public service.
Yeah, people like the, you know, shining things. And when you talk about campaigning, I mean, I still have my shoes that I walked and knocked on doors in my race for the state house. And those shoes have a hole in the bottom, right? Like a hole, like from walking that long. And I had slacks, dress shoes, and Sellers for house shirt. That's all I had. And I knocked on doors that had Confederate flags. I knocked on doors that had pit bulls on the front. Sometimes people tell you to go to hell. Sometimes people try to get you to marry their daughters. I mean, there was a whole wide array of you know, where we were. And it was just, you know, I think that, and I told Raphael Warnock this. I said, look, Reverend Dr. Warnock, I call him Raphael. I said, after they made it to the runoff, I said, if you don't knock on doors, we're not going to win. I know it's a pandemic. I get that. And you got to do it safely. But if you don't knock on doors, you're just not going to win. And we knocked on doors in Georgia from Chatham County to Valdosta to Richmond County, all the way through Atlanta. And that's how he won that race. We call it a Jimmy Carter style of politicking, but it's necessary.
Yeah, I love how you talk about it in the book. Okay, so now I want to go back to, you know, chronologically within the book, a day that you come back to frequently, and a day that I know really changed, well, created your life, even though it was long before you were born, which is the Orangeburg Massacre. And as you know, because you shared our post about it, which was so kind of you, when we posted, it was February 8th, I learned about the Orangeburg Massacre from your book when I read it in the spring. And it's shocking and really horrifying that it is not something that most Americans know about. I mean, it's horrifying, and I want to have you tell everyone what it is for anyone who hasn't read the book, but the fact, it's a horrific event. And also most people don't know about it.
Yes.
And it, you know, the way that it changed your family, your dad was arrested and in prison for, quote, instigating a riot that never happened. And it just changed. I mean, it changed your mom. It changed your relationship with your mom. It is a driving force for you, and of course for your dad. So, and for anyone who doesn't know this, Bakari's father is Cleveland Sellers, an icon of the civil rights movement, and Bakari is really a child of the civil rights movement. And so, you know, being able to learn from your experiences, Bakari, there's really no more important way, I think, to honor Black history than to learn from you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you outlined it better in your question than I could in my answer.
I don't think so. I don't think so.
No, I think that you know, for me, it is, it's not that my father was shot along with 27 others by law enforcement officers after they were protesting the All-Star Bowling Alley. It's not that 3 young men were killed, Henry Smith, Samuel Hammond, and Delano Middleton, that evening. It's not that my father was arrested. It's not that he was put on death row after he was arrested while his bond was denied for a month. It's not that all the officers who shot students that night and who shot into the group of students that night were charged, and they were all tried, and they were all found not guilty. And it's not necessarily that my father, you know, got charged, tried, and actually went to prison. I think that the greatest indictment is that people just don't know about it. Like you outlined in your question, I think that frankly is the most disappointing aspect of all of this. When you look at the Orangeburg Massacre, people know about Kent State mainly because white kids were killed. People know a little bit about Jackson State, but not many people know about the history of Orangeburg. And I think that that is the largest tragedy, because if people would have learned from South Carolina State and Orangeburg, there would have been no Jackson State, there would have been no Kent State, but they didn't. And so there was a lot of bloodshed that night. And I tell people the blood of my family runs through the soil of this great country. And yeah, it's the most important day of my life, although it happened nearly 20 some odd years before I was born. And, it's just a generation ago. And you talked about the impact on my family. When my father got out of prison, he was a felon in the Deep South. So you know how difficult that can be. The onus was on my mom to take care of a family, while not only give birth to a whole child while my dad was in prison, but also be able to take care of family for, decades, while the man in the house had a felony that was, unjust, at absolute best. So it was a tough situation, for them, but you stand on those shoulders, you recognize that strength. And for those individuals who want us to kind of get beyond this or move on, you recognize that this isn't something that you read about in history books from 100 years ago. Like, I still talk to my father, who went through this every single day.
Yeah, it's sort of a paradox, or you're sort of a paradox in your experience with it, because you say in the book that there's something empowering for you knowing that the officers who were not indicted, who faced no consequences whatsoever for this shooting, the 9 police officers, that that now they would have to face justice, and that the prosecutor could look like you, and that you are an attorney. And when we talk about criminal justice reform, which Zionist does a lot of work on criminal justice reform, I know a lot of the people watching do, and we talk about police accountability. We talk about what happens when someone is in prison, and how we pursue restorative justice and make sure that they do have professional opportunities, career opportunities afterward, because they serve their time, which of course for your father, he never ever should have served one day. So looking at it and realizing both that a lot hasn't changed, unfortunately, because these are issues that continue to happen, but also being able to recognize that a lot has changed. I guess my question for you is, as progressives, which I know we both are, it sometimes is hard to look at a situation and even believe in progress. And I think this is a challenge in the progressive left. There are a lot of people who just say America is irredeemable. We can't even try to make it better, because it's obvious that it is, systemically, it's just bad. It was, the foundations of the country were wrong. And so we can't even work with it. We have to start over. And I'm not sure. I don't think you believe that. I think you believe that progress is possible and that you are part of the story of progress, but would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think that whether or not you're looking at Langston Hughes' poem, his best poem in 1934 about America, when his last line was, let America be America, when he was talking about restoring its promise, or whether or not you're looking at Amanda Gorman, who talks about an imperfect America, I think that for me, not the biggest, but one of the larger issues we have is that individuals confuse their prejudice with patriotism these days. That's first. Second, you begin to see some of the better, or what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, when you look at things like Senator Padilla, Ossoff, and Warnock being sworn in on the same day by, Vice President Harris. I mean, of course, you have to remain hopeful during those times, but the realization is we have a lot of work to do. I mean, we have a trial starting March 8th. Now, I don't know anybody on this call who thinks that this officer is going to be found guilty. And if he is, then congrats. It will be mind blowing. But there is no historical precedent for you to believe that other than your well wishes and hopes, right? And so, as we're about to enter this new phase, we just got out of an insurrection and impeachment, where, white supremacy and domestic terror was full front and center. We now go to March 8th, where we have to relive a knee in the back of the neck of a Black man who passed a counterfeit $20 bill that he didn't even know was counterfeit and was screaming for his mother. And we have to relive those moments only for there to be a likelihood or chance that justice won't be had in this. So, this is, but I think one of the larger indictments is that it's cyclical. And I think we have to do our job to break that cycle, because this cycle has become exhausting.
Yeah, well said. So that, again, to jumping all over the place, to go to George Floyd, and then to go somewhere much later in your book where you talk about your anxiety and what you hold on your shoulders, in terms of showing up on CNN, knowing that you're reaching so many people and feeling like Black men are not allowed to exhibit emotion, are not allowed to show the pain and the trauma of your life experience and your family's life experience.
Well, it's not emotion, because I show emotion. It's an anger. Like it's a really weird thing. So, and the best way for me to describe it is the way that people describe Martin Luther King and John Lewis. It drives me crazy. Like, people want to act as if all John Lewis is like the dude who danced to Happy in front of the stage. Everybody's seen those images of him dancing, and they want to like hug him and pick him up and put him in their pocket. And it's a weird thing. People want to talk about King as if he was something he was not. Martin Luther King Jr. had a 32% approval rating, Gallup approval rating, when he died. People were afraid of him and scared of him, and they just fundamentally disliked him. Dr. King's approval rating when he died was lower than Donald Trump's approval rating today, right? So let's put some context around here. And so there is, and I have a podcast coming out next Monday with Andy Young, and we talk about this. And there is a great difficulty to, and there's a balance to strike when you are a Black man and not being angry, because it is for some reason offensive, and it strikes fear, and it builds into stereotypes that exist of hypermasculine, hypersexualized beings. And for me, it's just trying to cut through all of that and understand that the way that a lot of white America sees Black men is through the lens of me on CNN. So you can't afford to have a bad day is what I was trying to illustrate in the book.
Yeah, I mean, you do illustrate it. And, so what I wanted to say is that the way that you spoke about George Floyd, I will never forget. I think a lot of people saw that, and it was not just a humanizing, but as you know, I mean, we saw last summer, the reaction to it was a real awakening. And the way that you talked about that, anyone who hasn't seen it, just Google Bakari Sellers, George Floyd, and watch that clip. And if you don't understand, you'll understand after that clip.
Yeah, no, I'm actually starting my next book with that and a lot of background on that. That's like the first chapter, I think, if we decide. But yeah, it's it's just a trying time. It's an exhausting time. I mean, I think that when people analyze my life today or other people from the outside, if you look at it in full context, you just think about my father's story. Then you think about just being a millennial like you and I. Just think about all the things millennials have seen, right? 9/11, you remember where you were on 9/11. Every millennial remembers where they were on 9/11. School shootings, Sandy Hook, Parkland, etc. Remember Las Vegas? Remember that was a thing for like a week, right? People were concerned. We were thoughts and praying to Las Vegas. Las Vegas literally was the largest mass shooting in the history of the world, and nobody remembers it. Like, people are like, oh, if I just said it, and people are like, oh yeah, I remember that.
Right. Oh yeah, that happened too. Yeah.
Yeah, a housing crisis, a pandemic, a recession or two that we lived through. I lived through the Charleston massacre in Charleston, South Carolina, where a good friend was murdered.
We will talk about that.
George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. It's a lot. And I think that that exhaustion was something that shone through in the clip with George Floyd.
Yeah, I have to say, which is not at all the point that you're trying to make, but I remember exactly where I was at 9/11, and I was on the quad of my high school, and you and I are the same age. And in the book, you talk about how you were at Morehouse, and it's because you went to college when you were 16 years old.
I did. I was a little young when I went to school. I skipped 2 halves and a whole. That never fails. That's a question people always ask me. People always ask me, how was I so young in college? And to tell them more about Usher. Those are the two number 1 and 2 questions I get from this book from groups. You'd be
Well,
so
I'm glad our questions are a little a little deeper than Usher. Although the Usher story is very cool.
yeah. He's
Um,
a dope dude.
yeah, I'm sure. So, all right. So, one of the other sort of themes that I really want to touch on is about the relationship between the different Black movements, Black Power, the sort of traditional civil rights movement. And as you say, and you say beautifully in the book, and you've already said on the podcast, Martin Luther King Jr. was a revolutionary. He was not a moderate leader. And you talk about your frustration, of course, as you just did with, sanitizing history and trying to create something people are comfortable with out of Martin Luther King. I recently watched One Night in Miami, which I actually realized as I was thinking about these questions that I watched it because I heard you talk about it on your podcast with Durian McKesson, which everyone, I'm going to do a shout out for that too. If you don't follow Bakari, seriously, I learned so much from you. I mean, so much. This podcast with Durian McKesson, everyone who cares about criminal justice reform, I'm sorry.
Ray needs to come to your next Zionist town.
I would love that. Let's make it happen. It was fascinating because the point, at least the takeaway for me, is call it what you want to call it. Defund the police. It doesn't matter what you call it. It's about police accountability. It's about making sure that people are safe, and thinking about the ways that we can make that happen, whatever you want to call it. But the two of you together were absolutely brilliant. But anyway, there's an ad on that podcast for One Night in Miami. So I watched One Night in Miami.
Where is this going? I read these ads and I don't even know what show they go in half the time. Okay, I'm glad.
Did you watch it? Did you watch One Night in Miami?
Yes, of course. Yeah, it was great.
So all these things, I'm giving everyone so much homework, and we can send links for these things in our follow-up email to this. One Night in Miami is on Amazon Prime, and it is just a really awesome, really interesting movie. And one of the things I thought was most interesting was that it has Black leaders who from different schools of thought. And we often feel like the more traditional civil rights leaders, again, are the people that, that the white moderate, which King, of course, talked about his problem with the white moderate, that white moderates today are the ones that are comfortable with. And we talk about Black power and Black nationalism as something so nefarious and dangerous. And that's just the narrative, right? That like, you are either Black power or you are, the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
And you talk about this a lot. And I think it is so interesting because, now we have Black Lives Matter, and you talk about how Obama, for example, was uncomfortable really associating with Black Lives Matter, and how Black Lives Matter gets weaponized. So one of the things I think is really I would love to hear from you about is how important it is to actually recognize the issues, forget the titles, forget what you call, everyone wants the same thing who's part of these movements. And how do we kind of move past the labeling and the segmentation of, if you're in this group, then you're too radical, you're not radical enough, or, how do we talk about the issues instead of that stuff?
Yeah, no, I think that that's a fascinating question you ask. And One Night in Miami is actually a great segue for those who haven't watched it. It's about a fortuitous night with a lot of civil rights heroes who were there for an upset. Muhammad Ali, Leon Spinks, I want to say. And it was just a one night in Miami when they all happened to be there, all the greats watching the fight, and they got an opportunity to talk and spend time together. It's funny, I think back to Rosa Parks' story and how Rosa Parks got chosen to sit in on that bus. And I always think about how great of a woman Rosa Parks was. It frustrates me like to all hell that she died in so much poverty, but I think about how great she was. But I also think about the fact that we don't know names like Sarah Mae Fleming, who sat down on a bus 17 months before Rosa Parks and laid the foundation in action and law for Rosa Parks to sit down. I get frustrated that we know Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, which effectively overturned Plessy v. Ferguson and Separate but Equal, but nobody knows about Harry and Eliza Briggs, which was the case that was the original case in the landmark collection of cases known as Brown versus the Board of Education. It was Harry and Eliza Briggs and Briggs v. Elliott. And so the reason that I go through all of that is because there were a lot of everyday people who were a part of the movement who wanted to evoke some change from like the grassroots up, who were not any type of label other than individuals who wanted to join together and be of some collective mind, a singular cause and a common good, and go out and do God's work, for lack of a better term. And, you know, my dad was in SNCC, which was a younger organization, a more radical organization. My dad was, you know, somebody who was with Stokely, who is given credit, although he's not the one. Willie Ricks coined the term, but who created the term Black Power. And Black Power stoked so much fear in the hearts of white folk that it was like grab your purse, lock your doors, clench your, you know, clutch your pearls. When in all honesty, what they were talking about was Black economic power, Black political power, and self-sustaining in their own communities. And you had the Black Panther Party, of course, which, by the way, Judas, I don't know the full name of it, but the movie on, since we're shouting out movies, the movie on HBO Max is like so dope that it's the story of Fred Hampton, who died when he was 21 years old. A fascinating story. You had SCLC, which was more traditional, which was your C.T. Vivian. You had your John Lewis actually was a chairman of SNCC and then went over to SCLC. You had your Andy Youngs, you had your Martin Luther Kings, you had your more conservative establishment type. But at the end of the day, they all had one goal and they allowed each other to breathe. You had CORE. Weirdly enough, the NAACP played a role, but they were a structural organization that had a great deal of power and gravitas, but they weren't the people who were on the ground in Mississippi and Alabama, et cetera. A lot of times those were organizers in CORE. CORE was actually in the Midwest, but they were organizers in SCLC and SNCC. And to your point, when you come to things like, when you watch these organizations and the movement evolve, and you think about Black Lives Matter, there are a couple of things. One, it took us 7 years for people to actually be able to say Black Lives Matter, which is wild, right? You see Mitt Romney chanting Black Lives Matter on Black Lives Matter Plaza, which is somewhat surreal. With Jewish organizations, I always get tied down, and it's always like this weird hiccup, because it's like I don't want to call it intellectually dishonest, but it's this impediment that we for some reason cannot get over. And it's saying that people always want to say that I disagree with Black Lives Matter on one plank or platform when it comes to the issue of sympathizing with Palestine. And I say, okay. And that's the end of the conversation. And that's where the dishonesty lies, because as you and I've had these conversations many times before, I say, but do you agree with the other 12, 13 points and principles of Black Lives Matter? And the answer resoundingly is yes. And I say, well, have you had conversations or messengers, or have you talked to any individuals about this issue? And then the answer to that is no. And so the conversation just breaks down. And there's this barrier now that is weird, that is a barrier because no one communicates with anybody else because of some reason that I can't put my finger on. And so we have to do a better job. And I think you and I and a lot of people who are in our generation are having these conversations and are beginning to understand that, you know, Israel is an American value, and that the brightest light of democracy in the Middle East is Israel. And when you want to talk about progressive policies in the Middle East, you have to talk about Israel, right? So these are things, regardless of who the current prime minister is, but these are things that, you know, you can actually say, but we have to tell our story, but you have to be willing to communicate those things as well. And the biggest problem that we have in this country is, I've said that like 4 times. So people writing this down, they got like 4 biggest problems. But one of the biggest problems that we have is that
we have a handful.
I know we have an empathy deficit, but we also, like, we retreat to our own silos, and we only seek out news and opinions that reinforce our own. And we're very, very selfish in our struggles, which is something I write about. Like, do not be selfish in your struggle. And let me wrap up this very long answer to your question, because it was a good question. But, you know, my whole point is that, like, when you see me on stage at APAC, or you see me raising money for Planned Parenthood, right? Then I don't, it's cool for you to like buy me a drink at the Marriott bar at Velocity, right? That's dope. But like, um, if there is another young Black man who, is gunned down by the hands of police, then I expect to see you in the streets with me as well. That is the accountability we have to have as movement partners.
Wow, so much. I mean, I'm with you. I'm right there with you. I think one of the challenges, first of all, there's nothing to say about Black Lives Matter beyond Black Lives Matter. I mean, that's like, it's not a hard thing to say. People should say it. It's just, and I think you're right. I think there's been a sea change in that, in the comfort with it. And I think, the challenge with the Jewish Zionist launched really as a reaction to this kind of paradigm, this kind of paralyzation of the Jewish community and feeling like, oh my God, we can't participate in the progressive movements that we care about because we're afraid of the anti-Semitism that manifests there. And that is a destructive notion, not just for the advancement of the movements that we care about, but for the Jewish community. We can't cede progressive movements. We care too much about them. I will not stay out of the racial justice movement because there is an issue that is going on there. And I actually really don't think it's an issue that should be there, because I think it's harmful for the advancement of racial justice in this country. And I think it's divisive and problematic. Not to say that we should have sympathy with Palestine, of course we should, but to say that Israel should not exist, or that Israel is committing genocide, or that, Jews are not entitled to self-determination, that's where people get hung up. It's still wrong, because just like you said, if you're not participating, you can't have dialogue, and you can't come to consensus, and you can't stand together and advance the issues that really matter for both of our communities. And so, when you say we have a compassion deficit and that we're selfish in our activism, I want to say you are not. Either you do not have a compassion deficit and you are not selfish in your activism. And I think that's why so many people in the Jewish community are just so incredibly grateful for you.
I mean, we those are just, we can't be selfish in our activism. There has to be accountability, and I think that we're stronger because of it. And I think, the best example, again, is going back to what we know best is politics. You look at, weirdly enough, this is a very random fact that most people do not know, but they don't stay up at night and look at numbers or find themselves awake looking at election numbers from across the country. But did you know that Raphael Warnock got more Jewish votes in the state of Georgia than Jon Ossoff?
I didn't know it, but I was talking to a friend the day before the election, and we were sort of joking, but also sort of like, we bet that will happen. That is so funny. I'm not surprised.
So yeah, a lot of it has to do with the coalition that was built by John Lewis in Atlanta and the greater metro area of African Americans and Jews who came together. And I can't recall the name of Andrew Young just told me yesterday, but I can't recall the name of it's like it's a loose conglomerate of individuals who it still exists today, who propelled them. And I just thought that to be a very random, but, kind of feel good, random stat.
Well, so speaking of feel good, and Bakari knows I'm going to bring this up, the moment that it was announced that Reverend Warnock and Jon Ossoff, I don't remember if they had fully announced that Ossoff had won yet, but it was being announced that Reverend Warnock had won, and I think Jon Ossoff was still being counted, but it was pretty obvious where this was going to go. And Bakari was on CNN, and everyone's sort of freaking out. This is January 5th. This is the night before the Capitol insurrection, and tensions are high. People are emotional. Everybody's waiting to see what's going to happen. Where's the balance of the Senate going? And Bakari's first line out of his mouth, the first Black senator from the state of Georgia, this man who just this historic church, Martin Luther King's church, John Lewis, this tradition. And Bakari goes on CNN and says, this reminds me of the 1960s. This reminds me of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marching with Martin Luther King. This is the Black Jewish Alliance being reborn. I forgot exactly what you said, but it was like, oh my goodness. I was crying. I rewinded, recorded. Go ahead.
It was a fabulous moment. I think that, my friend Andrew Gillum has this really weird saying, and I'm not to sober your moment up, but it's so true. He always says that voting is the front door of democracy. And like when you get in the house, there's so much work to be done. Like everybody wants to get in, and then you get in, you look around, you're like, shit, we got some stuff to do in here, right? So we got to cook, we got to clean, we got to take care, So like, yeah, you come home, you want to get home, and then you get in, and you're like, oh my God, I got so much stuff to do, and that's the way it is. But we can have hope in what we're doing now, and I just think that there were so many of us who needed that glimpse of hope, especially after, November 3rd was a good day, but it wasn't as good as many people thought it would be for them. And you got to remember, we had 156 million people voted, I think. I'm a lawyer. I only count by thirds, so my math may be a little bit off, which is
You say in the book you weren't good at math.
yeah, no, I suck at math, which is a huge number of people. And you just have to think about the angst and anxiety and anger that so many people in this country had, that people are just looking for some semblance of hope. And that January 5th was a day where I found that. January 20th, with Kamala walking into the White House, was a day that I found that. And I think it's always good for you to find moments of hope. And I tell that to people every day, to kind of steal a riff off Jim Valvano. You try to love, you try to cry, you try to do all of these things every single day. And I think it's important for people to try to find something that makes them hopeful every day.
Well, that you on CNN made me about as hopeful as watching these two senators who had run this really extraordinary campaign together, overcome every odd, of course, with the help of Stacey Abrams and so many other people in Georgia. But seeing you with this, leaders, this huge platform and your leadership talk specifically about the relationship between our communities was really inspiring for me. So I just want to say thank you.
No, thank you.
And I think a lot of people are really hopeful, regardless of your politics, seeing the relationship between Reverend Warnock and Senator Reverend Warnock and Senator Ossoff. It's very inspiring, very exciting. And I hope it's indicative of what we're all doing on our much smaller platforms as well. And actually, it just reminded me of something that I wanted to ask you, which is, last year, you were speaking at APAC and you were on a stage in front of like 20,000 people, and it was the Monday before Super Tuesday. So all these things are happening.
I'm a visionary. You know
what I'm going to say.
I am a visionary. I want everybody to know I'm a visionary, but go ahead. You tell it.
So Bakari does all these things the night before, the day before this crazy thing happens. But anyway, so Bakari's on stage, he's speaking in front of literally 20,000 people. And Super Tuesday, so Bernie Sanders was winning the Democratic primary at this point, and really that was the direction of the Democratic primary. And Bakari's on stage and he says, next year at Policy Conference, which of course because of the pandemic is not happening, but he says, next year we are going to be celebrating President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. That was so unlikely. I have no idea. And so along the way, the next day, South Carolina votes overwhelmingly for Joe Biden, changes the whole trajectory of the race. Of course, South Carolina politics better than anyone. But so I was like, okay, 1 down for Bakari. And then he chooses Kamala Harris. I'm like, all right, 2 down for Bakari. I mean, so how did you know? How you were so prescient.
So I think it's good to peel back and understand how you should analyze things when you're looking at politics. I mean, Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada are not determinative of the primary process outcome. They're just not, because why? Black people don't vote in those 3 states outside of, say, for Clark County, which you should look at in Clark County. And if you would have looked at the results in Clark County and Nevada, where Las Vegas is, you would have seen that Joe Biden won 65% of the vote there. And we knew in South Carolina what was going to happen. And what happens after South Carolina? Super Tuesday, where a lot of Black voters vote. And so even Bernie Sanders would have told you that it was going to be hard pressed. He didn't expect to get shellacked in South Carolina the way he did, but he did. And so how do you build the coalition going forward? And you're not going to choose Elizabeth Warren, who's 70 years old, and you'll lose a seat in the Senate, which would be pretty close. You got Charlie Baker up there, who at the time, can possibly appoint a replacement. Bernie Sanders is also 70 some odd years old. You're not choosing him.
Biden's not a spring chicken though.
But that's what I'm saying. You're not going to have 2 septuagenarians be on the ticket together.
Okay.
So you have.
You're saying for the VP. Okay.
The VP, yeah. And so I mean, you narrow it down and you just look around and, he came down to most people don't know this. So I will share it with you guys, but his final two choices, he actually had a good friend of mine who was cutting ads. They cut two ads. One was for Susan Rice and one was for Kamala Harris. And he made the decision at that time that it was going to be Kamala Harris. And I didn't think Susan Rice would make it that far in the discussion, but she did. I like Susan Rice. Don't have anything against her, but I was really excited. And I just felt like the most talented person of those remaining was Kamala Harris. And it was an easy call to make. You should have heard the audience, 20,000 people with like 15,000 of them booing that, insisting that, and saying that's not going to happen. It's pretty surreal. That's why I wish we were having policy conferences this year, so I could just go back and just say that this is what I was doing.
Well, you're very close with Kamala.
Very close with Kamala.
A big fan of Kamala for a long time.
She finally doesn't have this is breaking my heart. She finally doesn't have a regular cell phone you can just text. I texted her yesterday and got this weird message back that like Secret Service had taken over her phone. So now I have to wait on her to call me. So I'm pretty sad about that.
All right. Well, it'll be okay. She'll call.
I know. I'm waiting every day. I'm waiting. I'm now picking up private phone calls, but that's okay.
Right. It's like Bibi waiting for Biden to call for the last month.
He called him. He
finally called. So she'll call. I know.
Speaking of which, I'm actually meeting with it's just you and I talking. I'm actually meeting with the new ambassador from Israel to the U.S. and United Nations on Sunday. So he's coming over to meet with some Black leaders. I guess that's what they call. It's a few of us. And he's coming to Charleston, South Carolina, and Montgomery, Alabama. So I look forward to spending that time with him.
That is fascinating. Thanks for sharing that with our audience. All right, so here's a fun one for you. You talk about, I was laughing out loud listening to you talk about this. You talk about jiving and how you and your friends used to just like make fun, just really rip each other in high school, and how actually I think you talk about it being a cultural thing. And so we'd love to hear you talk about it, more broadly, just beyond you and your friends. But you talk about how it prepared you for your career, for your Twitter account, for your political debates, for being a CNN commentator. And I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah, being a lawyer, being in front of a jury, going on TV, having to debate Kasich and Rick Santorum, being in the state legislature for a decade, there's some skill sets you learn. And being young, we used to call it jiving and joning or whatever people want to call it. But basically, you just pick on other people. And I was so young, and I was also really, really skinny, had this huge head. My clothes didn't fit well, and I was really smart. And people used to always pick on me. And so you had to have a way that you could snap back and be extremely witty. And so my wit a lot of times came from those verbal exchanges, which actually go back and are rooted in African culture, dating way, way back. And so it's just, we tried to, throughout the book, I tried to give some historical context to a lot of things, from shotgun houses to jiving and jonesing and all of those things. And so it really helps me with my tongue. It used to keep me in trouble a lot. Now it helps me get paid.
It's, again, I know I'm plugging you on every platform that you do, but Bakari's Twitter is really funny.
My Twitter, I have to keep my Twitter from getting me sued, but no, my Twitter is funny, I do think. And I had a lot of fun at the expense of Rafael Cruz today, like most of America. I
haven't been on Twitter today, so I got to check that out. He's in trouble.
Yes.
Anyway. All right, so I want to, and if you have questions, feel free to put them in. I have a lot more questions, but I do want people to have the opportunity to ask you some questions. And I really want to go to a sad thing, but it's a really important thing historically and for you, and it is about Mother Emanuel. And you talked about Clem, your pastor. You mentioned him already on this call, but you talk in the book about how when you originally ran, and for anyone who doesn't know, I didn't do Bakari's bio on purpose, but he was the youngest person to ever be elected to the South Carolina state legislature. And then he ran for lieutenant governor, and you got to read the book to hear, the whole story of that. But you talk about how you originally ran. One of the things that you cared the most about when you ran was taking down the Confederate flag. And then you come back to that. This is another kind of thing that I realized that you come back to in, later in the book, how ultimately you saw the flag come down at the South Carolina State House after the shooting of Mother Emanuel. And you talk about your own experience being on TV on, every network talking about that. And so tie it in for us to issues of race and white supremacy. And
I think that, I, I'll tie it into an issue of grace, because Clem went out the way that we would all expect him to, which is he welcomed the straggly white boy that he'd never seen before in his life with a book bag on into his church on Wednesday, which is Bible study. Most people know that, particularly in the South, if you want to find Black folk on Wednesday, you go to church because that's where everybody is. It's Bible study. And they were sitting in a circle. It was 12 of them. Clem's wife, Jennifer Pinckney, and their daughter were in the office. And he set Dylan Roof right beside him, and they worshiped and prayed and studied the Bible for a full hour. And when they bowed their head to do the benediction, Dylan Roof took out a 9mm and shot Clem in the neck, and then shot 8 others, and then stood over Polly Shepard, who I always say young lady, and she gets so mad at me for saying that. Polly has to be like 75, 76. And so she stood over her and said that, "I'm gonna let you live so somebody can tell the story." Clem actually lived the longest. He made it to the hospital and subsequently died at the hospital. And it was just a crazy, surreal night, having to get his wife out of the church, and there's a hotel right across the street, get her back home with her daughter. Just the security, people didn't know where Dylan was at the time. Then later watching the treatment of Dylan Roof, he got to go to Burger King after he was arrested for murdering 9 people in a church. George Floyd was brutally murdered. So, just the pain that was associated with that. It wasn't just an attack on Black folk. It was an attack on our religion and faith. It was by far the hardest, few weeks of my life. It was in Charleston. The national media, international media was already there, because people forget that it was 2015 and people had already announced that they were running for president of the United States in 2016. So I was actually about 2 blocks away the day that it happened at a fundraiser for Hillary Clinton. Marco Rubio was in town, Rick Santorum was in town, many others were in town. And so the media just stayed. And I literally moved to Charleston for about 2 weeks. That happened on a Wednesday night. Of course, they had service on Sunday, and it was just kind of put together. And a lot of us were out in the street while they had service. They were like, "Do you want to come into the church?" And I was like, "There's no way I'm going to take a seat away from a member of that church." So I stood outside and watched. Then they had the next Wednesday Bible study that was jam-packed. Everybody was at Bible study. It was kind of like, no one will attack this church. And then the next most important moment was the funeral of Clem. He had the first funeral they had at a TD Arena. And everybody remembers Barack. I was sitting next to Sunny Hostin from The View. She was at CNN then, but Barack Obama singing Amazing Grace at that time. And it was a surreal moment, one that we never thought that we were going to live by. But it's also like, when people ask about being hopeful, we were hopeful at that moment. When Barack sang Amazing Grace, everybody thought the country would change. We thought that finally we would get there when they saw the pain of his little girls. But, we missed that moment. As a country, we have a propensity to miss moments. And so we have to make sure that we make the most of this one.
And the Confederate flag.
Yeah, the Confederate flag, it was unique because I would have never guessed it would have come down. That was something I would have never guessed that would have happened. And I wrote an op-ed piece that day that said, "I wish my father was there to see the Confederate flag." He was on vacation, and he was like, "Man, I ain't coming back." He's like, "This is for y'all. This is the next generation. This is your time. I'm gonna enjoy my vacation." He was in Kiowa. He's like, "I'm gonna enjoy my vacation." And it was a powerful moment. I mean, we all cried watching that symbol come down, but it was just a symbol at the end of the day. And a lot of us aren't into the symbolism, like painting the streets Black Lives Matter, or tearing down statues, or renaming anything, because the structural changes that are needed get whitewashed when we do those things. And so, the flag came down, but the systemic inequities still remain. And it was a contentious vote. I give Nikki Haley a lot of credit. I don't give her credit for a lot, but I do give her a lot of credit for having the political courage to pull together a coalition to take the flag down. It was the right time. But from a larger view, people have to remember that every ounce of political change we've ever had in this country is because of Black blood flowing in the streets, from the 1964-65 Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act to 1968 Fair Housing Act, which happened after the king was assassinated, to the Confederate flag. I mean, Black folk have to literally pay a very high price to achieve any semblance of change in this country.
Thank you for that. And again, please read the book if you haven't, and learn about Clem and learn about what happened. I'm sure everyone knows about what happened at Mother Emanuel, but Bakari really puts it into historical context and personal context, and I think it's very important. And I have another really important question, and then we'll go the questions in the chat. I think are going to be pretty easy for you. It's another hard one, but it's something I know you want to talk about, and I hope others want to hear about, which is Black maternal mortality. And
one political issue.
I know it's your number one political issue, and I want to hear the story of your wife, your gorgeous wife, giving birth to your twins, and also your commitment to healthcare for people of color, and the intersection of health inequity and racial justice and economic inequality. And
that's a big question. Do we have an hour left? No, I know we're wrapping up.
30 seconds, just kidding. But I just want to plug really quickly. Thank you all to everyone who made the contribution to the Sadie Ellen Fund and that we sent books to. And please, Daryl is going to put in the chat, both on the comments on Facebook and in the chat in the Zoom for anyone who wants to. We've been asking for $18 contributions to the Sadie Ellen Fund, which Bakari can tell us about. And we still have a few books that we can send you if you forward Daryl will write this in the chat, but just when you forward your contribution receipt to Lauren@zionist.org, we will send you a copy of My Vanishing Country, which if you don't have, I know you want because I've plugged it enough times.
So, yeah, I mean, it was a traumatic experience. At 5:28, Stokely was born, 5:33, Sadie was born. By 10 o'clock, Ellen had passed out. She had gotten really hot and began to throw up. It was just it was a very urgent, traumatic, trying experience, because this is a story we had all heard. Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die during childbirth than white women. She had lost 7 units of blood, which I think your body probably only has about 8 or 9 units. And it was just, you say those college prayers, dear Lord, you get me through this, the prayers you say on Friday, Saturday night. Those are the prayers that, when you have a long night, those are the prayers that I said. Like, if you get me through this, I promise I'll never do this again. I promise I'll never do that again. And it was just an experience I don't wish on anybody. Ellen spent the first 36 hours of our kid's life in ICU. She had a very long surgery that night. The whole hallway was blocked off. Nurses, of course, were moving slow, but we had Black doctors. And I said this on TMZ, and people had felt some sort of way about it, but we had Black doctors who were in our friend group. So I was able to FaceTime and then call them when the nurses were moving slow. And we actually had a neighbor who's an OBGYN who saw the alarm and came by the room. I thank God for her as well. And access to quality care has always been something, because I come from a community that does not have care. Like, you can't, they're 13-year-olds who've never seen a dentist. They're 40-year-old women who've never had a mammogram. That's just, and it's hard to expect people to be able to survive without or thrive without just fundamental access to care. And so, whether or not it's African-American female mortality, I've learned a lot about the healthcare system. 1, from the lack of access. 2, from my wife's trials, and African-American female mortality. And 3, from Sadie, who had to have her liver transplant when she was 1 year old. It was September 1st of her first year on this earth. She got diagnosed when she was about 2 months old with biliary atresia, which is a very rare liver disorder. And so, just through all of those things, those 3 different perspectives, traumatic perspectives on our healthcare delivery system, give me a very unique, nuanced insight onto where we are and what we need to be doing going forward.
Thank you. So there's a couple of questions that I have one more to close on that I think will be a fun one. So one person asked, Barbara asked, what are you most excited about in this time of trial and tribulations? What gives you the most optimism today?
The most optimism today, it's probably my kids. I mean, it's the most optimism, but it's also the most urgency, I guess, because you want to change the world for them. I have a 15-year-old and 2-year-old twins. So it's a mix. It's a challenging mix, but the 15-year-old is already there, fighting the good fight, being able to see and understand. The 2-year-olds, you want them to inherit something better than you did. And so that's my challenge and that's my hope. Those are the two that those are the two things, or the three individuals that I look to for that sense of hope. I can't find it outside of home because it's hard. I mean, I am somewhat jaded by reality, I guess. But what happens in this house and the smiles and the giggles keep you going forward and keep you going strong.
They're so cute, your children. All right, so another question is, you have twin toddlers, and I'm going to add also a teenage daughter, which is a whole handful, having been one of those. You also have a legal career, a podcast, a political career, and a TV career. How do you have time for all of it? Are you one of those people who only sleeps a few hours a day?
Yeah, I'm doing better about that now. But when I was going, the pandemic slowed us down a lot, so I'm able to get in bed. You're past my bedtime now. I'm usually in bed at 9:30. I know I am someone who tries to, that don't mean I'm asleep, but I'm usually in bed. I try to get in bed at a reasonable time and sleep as much as I can throughout the evening. The twins are up at 6 and they, you don't really, if they sleep that long, and then they're in the bed with us. But, in the words of the great American poet, Christopher Wallace, also known as Biggie Smalls, you sleep when you die. So there's a lot of work to be done, and you just burn it at both ends and make sure that you love, and make sure that you smile, and make sure that you laugh, and make sure that you pray every single day.
All right, so the last audience question, I think probably is from one of your friends, I have to say.
Oh Lord, let me vet.
No, it's fine. It's totally fine. It's just funny because I think that's what it has to be, unless we got a real sports fan here on the Zionist side. Besides the level of competition, what do you see as the differences between Justin Fields and Trey Lance? Deshaun Watson is the most common comp for Fields. Do you buy it? I love Fields' best games, but I'm concerned about games like Indiana and Northwestern.
That's a good question. That's an in-depth question. Trey Lance is a monster. He's underrated. Unfortunately, people have Trey as the 4th best quarterback on the board. They have Trevor Lawrence. They have Zach Wilson, which I don't know why he's number 2. And they have Justin Fields at number 3 and Trey Lance at number 4. Deshaun Watson is huge. Deshaun Watson is bigger than Justin Fields. Justin's going to need to sit behind. Hopefully he gets drafted by the Atlanta Falcons as the next up for Matt Ryan. But he's going to have to kind of grow a little bit, because I'm interested to see Ohio State produce a quality quarterback. But if anybody can do it, Justin can. Justin is a really good athlete, competitive athlete. So we'll see. I think he's the 2nd best quarterback in the draft behind Trevor Lawrence. And I think that Trey Lance is 3rd, and I think Zach Wilson is 4th, but we'll see how that plays out.
So whoever asked the question before that, Bakari also has a sports career, broadcasting career going on. So there's a lot happening here. All right, so the closing question, I don't want it to sound negative, however you want to take it, obviously, but I want to ask you about race and politics today, and you reflect a lot on it in the book, and there are a couple things that I think really stand out, and then I want to see where you take the question. You go through a really fascinating and exciting explanation of your endorsement of Barack Obama and in 2008, and actually you talk about if you were Barack Obama was brought to you by our friend Anton Gunn, who I messaged today and told him we were doing this, and he said, "Tell Sellers I love that guy." So and it's fascinating. This is where you mentioned Usher before. Again, everyone has to read the book to really get the full breadth of that. And then you sort of come back to it at the end with President Obama's, I don't know about fear, but hesitance to fully embrace Black Lives Matter. You talk about race and the role that it played in Trump's presidency and the 2016 election. There's just, race is so prominent in really everything that we're dealing with right now. And I think, we've talked a lot about this, is this a reckoning? Are we going to be able to truly advance racial justice? And how do we, as another thing that you talk about is people voting against their interests. How do we change the paradigm? What are the upsides of where we are, and how do we continue moving in a positive trajectory?
I don't like the word racial reckoning. I think it might be for some, but for Black folk in this country, this is another day that ends in Y. So I don't think this is a reckoning. Let me quote Ronald Reagan, which I dare not do often, ever actually, but Ronald Reagan, he didn't invent this saying, but it was made a famous political slogan of his: trust but verify. The question is, will white folk in this country still be caring, in a year? Will the uptick in people caring after George Floyd, after a very hot summer, after the pandemic, after you're able to go back outside, because you're in New York, you can't go nowhere. But when you're able to go back outside and resume your normal lives, will people still care? Racism isn't on Black folk in this country to cure. We have a lot of ills that we must solve, and we have a lot of things we must do. Fixing racism in this country ain't one. And it takes white folk talking to other white folk. It takes having those uncomfortable conversations. It takes, people always want to ask me about the conversations I have with my children about their interactions with law enforcement and things like that. And I'm like, no, what are you teaching your kids about how to interact with my kids? What examples are you setting at home and in the workplace about how you treat other Black folk? So I just think we have a lot of work to do. And I don't know if it's a reckoning, because that sounds big. I don't want people to think it's big. I want people to take it and treat it like you treat an apple, which is one bite at a time, one day at a time, pushing back on microaggressions, uplifting, emboldening others to do the work, sometimes being quiet, sometimes listening, sometimes taking a step forward, understanding when to do one or the other. And so there's a lot of work to be done, but because of people like you, I have faith. And because of people like you, I think that we'll get there one day.
Well, that is very kind. I just want to thank you again. I could talk to you I hope we will, for many more hours, but I know you have to go to bed, and I just want to really say thank you so much, first of all, for joining us, but also for writing this book. I think the critical acclaim speaks for itself. This is a New York Times bestseller. It's everywhere. A lot of people are talking about this book. It's making a big impact. It's a year now. Unbelievable. It's been a year.
The paperback copies start coming out in May. So yes, it's been a year.
Crazy. And I'm still waiting for you to come to New York. I know you can't, to sign my book, but it's been a year since, we first talked about doing something like that. And also last year when we talked about your book before it came out, and I said, I can't believe you have a memoir. You're 35 years old. And there are so many more. So I'm so happy that you're already working on your second memoir.
Yeah, no, I have a children's book that's coming out in January, and then the adult book will come out in the next summer or fall.
All right, so we'll add that to your list of all the things that you have.
That's already done. The children's book is done, so it's going to be dope. It's called Who Are Your People? It's a really good children's.
Oh, amazing. Can't wait to buy that and do a book club on it for Zionist children. But thank you for your friendship, for making time for this with everything else that you have to do, and also for your allyship to the Jewish community.
I look forward to us pushing each other to be better. So thank you so much. Have a great evening. And thank everybody for taking time out to be with us today. I'll see everybody soon.